She seduced the two most powerful men on the planet. She commanded the richest kingdom on earth. She spoke 9 languages, led armies into battle, and nearly destroyed the Roman Empire from within. And when the walls finally closed in, she chose death on her own terms, with a venomous snake pressed against her skin. This is the story of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt. And I promise you, everything you think you know about her is probably wrong. Most people picture Cleopatra as this impossibly beautiful woman who batted her eyelashes and men just fell at her feet. Hollywood has spent decades selling you that version. Elizabeth Taylor in heavy eyeliner and golden robes. A seductress, a temptress, a woman whose only weapon was her beauty. But the real Cleopatra? She was something far more dangerous than beautiful. She was brilliant, ruthlessly brilliant. The kind of brilliant that made emperors question everything they believed in. The kind of brilliant that made the most powerful empire in history feel genuinely afraid of a single woman. And her story? It does not end with romance. It ends with blood, betrayal, and the collapse of a 3,000-year-old civilization. So buckle up, because the true story of Cleopatra is darker, wilder, and more shocking than anything Hollywood ever dared to show you. Let us go back to the beginning. The year is 69 BC. Egypt is no longer the unstoppable force it once was. The pyramids are already ancient relics, over 2,000 years old. The great pharaohs of the past, Ramesses, Tutankhamun, Hatshepsut, they are dust in distant memory. But Egypt is still fabulously, almost obscenely wealthy. The Nile Delta produces more grain than any region on Earth. Gold flows in from Nubian mines. Trade routes stretch from India to the Mediterranean. Alexandria, the capital, is the most dazzling city in the ancient world. And I need you to understand just how extraordinary Alexandria was. This was not some dusty desert outpost. Alexandria had the Great Library, containing an estimated 400,000 scrolls. The entire accumulated knowledge of the ancient world, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, medicine, all of it, housed in one place. It had the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a tower so tall that its flame could be seen 30 miles out at sea. It had paved streets, running water, and a sewer system. While Rome was still a rough, aggressive, military city, Alexandria was already the intellectual capital of the known world. And ruling over all of this was the Ptolemaic dynasty. Now here is the first thing that surprises people. Cleopatra was not Egyptian. Not ethnically, anyway. The Ptolemies were Greek. Macedonian Greek, to be precise. Cleopatra's ancestor, Ptolemy I, was one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. When Alexander died in 323 BC and his massive empire shattered into pieces, his generals grabbed what they could. Ptolemy grabbed Egypt, smart man. He grabbed the richest prize of all, and his family held it for nearly 3 centuries. But the Ptolemies had a problem. They ruled Egypt, but they were not Egyptian. They spoke Greek. They followed Greek customs. They built Greek temples. For almost 300 years, the Ptolemies sat on the throne of Egypt like foreign tourists who refused to go home. The Egyptian people served them, worked for them, built their monuments, but there was always a wall between the rulers and the ruled. And here is what made Cleopatra different from every single Ptolemy who came before her. She actually bothered to learn Egyptian. She spoke the language of her people. She studied their religion. She understood their gods. She presented herself not as a Greek queen ruling over Egypt, but as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, the mother goddess, the protector, the divine queen. Every Ptolemy before her had governed Egypt like foreign occupiers. Cleopatra governed Egypt like an Egyptian queen. And that one decision, that one act of cultural respect changed everything. The Egyptian people did not just obey her. They loved her. She also spoke Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, Parthian, Median, Ethiopian, and troglodyte, 9 languages in total. In an age when most rulers could barely read their own correspondence, Cleopatra could walk into any room in the ancient world and speak to anyone in their own tongue. Think about how powerful that is. She did not need translators. She did not need intermediaries. She could look a Parthian ambassador in the eye and negotiate in his own language. She could read Roman legal documents without help. She could charm Ethiopian diplomats in their native tongue. That is not seduction. That is strategy. That is intellectual dominance. Now, let us talk about how she actually got the throne. Because it was anything but smooth. In fact, it was a bloodbath. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was a weak, incompetent king. The people called him Auletes, which means the flute player, behind his back. Not exactly a fearsome title for the ruler of the richest nation on earth. He spent most of his reign bribing Rome to leave Egypt alone, hemorrhaging the national treasury in the process. He was basically paying protection money to the Roman Republic, and everyone knew it. When Ptolemy XII finally died in 51 BC, he left the throne to Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. She was 18. He was 10 years old. A teenager and a child, inheriting the most coveted kingdom on the planet. And this is where it gets ugly. In the Ptolemaic tradition, royal siblings were expected to marry each other. Yes, you heard that right. Brother and sister, husband and wife. It sounds repulsive to modern ears. And honestly, it was not particularly popular even back then. But the Ptolemies believed it kept the bloodline pure and the power consolidated. So Cleopatra was forced into a co-rulership and a symbolic marriage with her 10-year-old brother. But Cleopatra had zero intention of sharing power with a child. Zero. She started making moves immediately. She put her name first on all official documents. She struck coins bearing only her face, not her brother's. She made policy decisions without consulting the boy king's advisors. She was sending a clear, unmistakable message to everyone in the palace. I am the ruler here, not the child, not his handlers. Me. Her brother's advisors noticed, and they were not happy. These were powerful, cunning, dangerous men. Pothinus, a eunuch who controlled the royal treasury and had more political connections than anyone in the kingdom. Theodotus, the boy king's tutor, a Greek intellectual with a taste for manipulation. And Achillas, the general who commanded Egypt's military forces. Together, they formed a shadow council that actually ran the country. Young Ptolemy was their puppet, and they saw Cleopatra for exactly what she was, a threat to their power. Within 2 years, they had organized a full-scale coup. Cleopatra was driven out of Alexandria by force, exiled from her own kingdom, stripped of her crown and her authority. At 20 years old, she was wandering the deserts east of Egypt, somewhere near the border of modern-day Syria, with nothing but a small band of loyal followers and a burning, unquenchable determination to take back what was hers. Most people in her position would have accepted defeat, would have faded into obscurity, would have become a historical footnote, just another deposed royal in a long line of palace coups. But Cleopatra was not most people. She did not run away from her problem. She ran straight toward the most dangerous man on earth, and she did it in the most audacious, insane, theatrical way imaginable. The year is 48 BC. Julius Caesar, the most powerful and feared man in the Roman Republic, has just arrived in Alexandria. But he is not there for Cleopatra. He is not there for Egypt. He is chasing his bitter rival, Pompey the Great, who fled to Egypt after losing a catastrophic civil war against Caesar. Rome is tearing itself apart, and Pompey thought Egypt would be a safe haven. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong. When Pompey's ship approached the Egyptian shore, Ptolemy's advisors made a cold calculation. They could shelter Pompey and risk Caesar's wrath, or they could hand Caesar his enemy's head and win his favor. They chose option 2. Pompey was stabbed to death as he stepped off his boat, within sight of his wife and children watching from the ship. Then they cut off his head. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria, Ptolemy's advisors presented him with the severed head of Pompey as a welcoming gift. They were practically beaming with pride. They expected Caesar to be grateful, to be relieved, to reward them handsomely. They were dead wrong. Caesar was disgusted. Pompey had been a Roman consul, a Roman general, a man who had once been married to Caesar's own daughter. They had been rivals, yes, but they were both Romans. Murdering him was one thing. War is war. But cutting off his head and presenting it like a hunting trophy, that was an insult to Rome itself. Caesar reportedly wept when he saw the head. And now he was sitting in Alexandria, surrounded by people he despised and did not trust, in a kingdom that was ripping itself apart in a civil war between a child king and his exiled sister. This is where Cleopatra made her move, the most famous entrance in all of ancient history. She needed to reach Caesar, but she could not walk into the palace. Her brother's soldiers controlled every entrance. They had orders to kill her on sight. Any attempt to enter Alexandria openly would be suicide. So she came up with a plan that was either genius or insanity. Probably both. She had herself rolled up inside a linen sack. Some ancient sources say it was a carpet. Either way, she was bound up inside a large bundle and carried on the back of a single loyal servant named Apollodorus. He walked right past the palace guards, carrying what appeared to be a delivery of bedding or goods. Nobody questioned it. Nobody searched it. And he carried her directly to Caesar's private quarters. When the sack was unrolled, and Caesar found himself face to face with the exiled Queen of Egypt, imagine his reaction. Here was a 21-year-old woman who had just smuggled herself past an entire army of enemies, risked her life on an insane gamble, all to make her case directly to the most powerful man alive. She had no army behind her, no leverage, no backup plan. All she had was herself, her intelligence, and her nerve. And it worked, not because she was beautiful. Ancient coins and sculptures suggest Cleopatra had a prominent nose and a strong jaw. She was not ugly, but she was not the goddess of beauty that Hollywood invented. What she had was something far more compelling. She had charisma, she had wit, she had fearlessness. And she had an encyclopedic knowledge of politics, philosophy, and history that could hold the attention of a man like Caesar, who had seen and done everything. The ancient historian Plutarch wrote that her presence and conversation were irresistible. Her voice was like a musical instrument that she could tune to any occasion. Caesar was 52 years old. He had conquered Gaul, defeated Pompey, and stood at the pinnacle of Roman power. And he was captivated by a 21-year-old who had just shown him more courage and intelligence than any Roman senator he had ever met. Within hours, they had formed an alliance. Was there romance? Absolutely. But make no mistake, this was first and foremost a cold, calculated, mutual political partnership. Cleopatra needed Caesar's battle-hardened legions to reclaim her throne. Caesar needed Egypt's bottomless grain supplies and gold reserves to fund his ongoing wars and consolidate power in Rome. They each had exactly what the other desperately needed: love and strategy wrapped up together. What followed was the Alexandrian War, and it was absolute chaos. Ptolemy's general Achilles led an army of 20,000 soldiers against Caesar's much smaller force. The Romans were besieged inside the palace district of Alexandria. It was brutal, street by street fighting in one of the most densely populated cities on earth. Buildings were burned. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. And during the chaos, the fire spread to the docks and then to warehouses near the Great Library. Countless scrolls, irreplaceable texts that had taken centuries to collect, were destroyed. An intellectual catastrophe on top of a military one. But Caesar was Caesar, the greatest military mind of his generation. He held out through sheer tactical brilliance until reinforcements finally arrived. Then he crushed Ptolemy's army in a decisive battle along the Nile. Young Ptolemy XIII tried to flee across the river and drowned. dragged under by the weight of his own golden armor. A fitting end, perhaps, for a puppet king, weighed down by the ambitions of others. At 21, Cleopatra was now the sole ruler of Egypt, and she was carrying Caesar's child. Their son was born in 47 BC and named Ptolemy Caesar, though everyone called him Caesarion, which means Little Caesar. Cleopatra brought the boy to Rome the following year, where she lived in one of Caesar's luxurious villas across the Tiber River. Imagine the scandal. The most powerful man in Rome, a married man, openly keeping an Egyptian queen and their illegitimate son just outside the city walls. Roman senators were horrified. The traditional families were outraged. The common people were fascinated and gossiped endlessly. And Caesar did not care what any of them thought, not one bit. He even placed a golden statue of Cleopatra in the temple of Venus Genetrix, his family's patron goddess. It was a statement that shocked Rome to its foundation. He was essentially saying, "This foreign queen stands alongside the gods of Rome." The resentment boiled. The whispers grew louder, and on March 15th, 44 BC, those whispers turned into daggers. Julius Caesar was assassinated, stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Roman Senate by a group of conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius. The greatest man in Rome bled to death at the foot of Pompey's statue. When Cleopatra received the news, she knew immediately that Rome had become a death trap. Without Caesar's protection, she and Caesarion were in mortal danger. She packed up and fled back to Egypt as fast as the Mediterranean winds would carry her. Her protector was gone. Her lover was dead. And once again, she was completely alone. But Cleopatra was a survivor. And the most dramatic, most passionate, most devastating chapter of her life was just beginning. After Caesar's assassination, Rome descended into a vicious power struggle. On one side was Caesar's adopted heir, a young man named Octavian. He was only 18, but he was cold, calculating, and patient in a way that terrified everyone around him. On the other side was Marc Antony, Caesar's most loyal general and closest friend, a warrior, a leader, a man of enormous appetites and enormous flaws. Eventually, after years of maneuvering, Octavian and Antony carved the Roman world in half. Octavian took the western provinces, Antony took the east, and controlling the east meant one unavoidable thing. It meant dealing with Egypt. In 41 BC, Marc Antony summoned Cleopatra to the city of Tarsus in what is now southern Turkey. He needed her money. Egypt's wealth was legendary, almost mythical, and Antony needed massive amounts of gold to fund a planned military campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east. He expected Cleopatra to come humbly, as a client queen, to beg for his favor and protection. Instead, she put on the greatest show the ancient world had ever seen. She arrived on a golden barge with a purple sail. The stern was gilded with gold. The oars were made of silver, rising and falling in time to the music of flutes, pipes, and harps. Cleopatra herself was dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, reclining under a golden canopy fringed with jewels, while beautiful attendants dressed as sea nymphs worked the rudder and the ropes. Boys dressed as cupids fanned her with perfumed ostrich feathers. Clouds of incense billowed from the deck, so thick that people standing on the riverbanks could smell her coming long before they could see her. The entire city of Tarsus emptied out to watch. The market stalls were abandoned. People climbed on rooftops. Antony was left sitting alone in the town square, waiting for a queen who never came to him. Instead, she invited him to dine aboard her ship, and the banquet she had prepared was so lavish, so overwhelming in its extravagance, that Antony was left speechless. No, Marc Antony was nothing like Caesar. Caesar was calculated, cerebral, always thinking 10 moves ahead, like a chess player who never lost. Antony was the opposite. He was a soldier through and through, big, loud, emotional, impulsive, quick to laugh and quick to anger. He loved wine, feasting, gambling, and living large. He was the kind of man who led cavalry charges from the front and drank with his soldiers around the campfire afterward. And Cleopatra read him perfectly. With Caesar, she had been the intellectual equal, the political strategist, the philosophical sparring partner. With Antony, she became the life of the party. She matched him drink for drink, joke for joke, adventure for adventure. She transformed herself into exactly what he wanted, while never losing sight of what she needed. They spent the winter of 41 BC together in Alexandria, and the ancient sources describe it as one long, unending, legendary celebration. They formed a drinking club called the Inimitable Livers, which roughly translates to those who live beyond comparison. They would disguise themselves as common citizens and roam the streets of Alexandria. At night, knocking on doors, playing pranks on confused citizens, getting into brawls in taverns. A Roman general and the Queen of Egypt stumbling through alleyways at 2 a.m, laughing like teenagers. One famous story perfectly captures their dynamic. Cleopatra bet Antony that she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal. That is an almost incomprehensible sum of money in the ancient world. Antony laughed. Impossible. He took the bet. At dinner, Cleopatra removed one of her enormous pearl earrings, a pearl so valuable it was said to be the largest in the known world. She dropped it into a cup of vinegar, watched it dissolve, and drank it. 10 million sesterces, swallowed in one gulp. Antony conceded. He knew he had met his match. But behind all the parties and spectacle and drinking games, Cleopatra was always playing the long game. She bore Antony 3 children. First came the twins, a boy and a girl named Alexander Helios, and Cleopatra Selene, sun and moon. Then a third child, Ptolemy Philadelphus. She was not just building a romance. She was building a dynasty. She was binding Antony to Egypt through blood, through family, through children who would one day inherit both Roman power and Egyptian wealth. Every kiss was strategy. Every child was a chess piece. And then came the event that set the whole world on fire. In 34 BC, Antony held a spectacular public ceremony in Alexandria, known as the Donations of Alexandria. Before a crowd of tens of thousands, he distributed the eastern territories of Rome to Cleopatra and their children as if they were his personal property. Cleopatra was declared Queen of Kings and Queen of Egypt. Caesarion was declared King of Kings and the legitimate heir of Julius Caesar. Their children were given Armenia, Media, Parthia, Cyrenaica, Libya, and Syria. Entire kingdoms, handed out like party favors. Back in Rome, when news reached Octavian, he erupted. This was not just an insult. This was an existential threat. A Roman general was giving away Roman territory to a foreign queen and her children. He was choosing Egypt over Rome. He was elevating a Ptolemaic dynasty above the Roman Republic. Octavian used the outrage brilliantly. He did not declare war on Antony directly. That would look like another Roman civil war, and Romans were sick of civil wars. Instead, he declared war on Cleopatra, the foreign queen who had corrupted and bewitched a great Roman general. It was a masterpiece of propaganda, and Rome rallied behind him. The final confrontation came on September 2nd, 31 BC, at the Battle of Actium, off the western coast of Greece. It was one of the largest naval battles in ancient history. Antony and Cleopatra assembled a combined fleet of over 500 warships and 100,000 soldiers. Octavian's fleet was smaller but faster, commanded by his brilliant admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, perhaps the finest naval commander Rome ever produced. The battle was a disaster for Antony and Cleopatra. Agrippa's lighter, more maneuverable ships outflanked Antony's heavy warships. Disease had ravaged Antony's crews in the weeks before the battle. And worst of all, Antony's allies began defecting in the middle of the fight, turning their ships around and surrendering to Octavian. And then, something happened that historians have argued about for 2,000 years. Cleopatra's personal squadron of 60 Egyptian warships suddenly broke away from the battle line and sailed south toward open water. Antony, when he saw her leaving, abandoned his entire fleet and raced after her in a small, fast ship. He left his men behind, he left his soldiers, he left his legacy. Some historians believe it was a prearranged escape plan, that they knew the battle was lost and Cleopatra was rescuing the treasury ships. Others believe Antony simply panicked when he thought Cleopatra was fleeing and made the most catastrophically emotional decision of his military career. Either way, the result was the same. When the rest of the fleet saw both their commanders sailing away, all resistance collapsed. Octavian won a total, crushing victory, and Antony and Cleopatra sailed back to Egypt as defeated, humiliated fugitives. What followed was a slow, agonizing collapse that lasted almost a year. Antony fell into a profound depression. He built a small hut on a jetty at the edge of Alexandria's harbor and called it the Timonium, named after Timon of Athens, a legendary misanthrope who hated all of humanity. Antony sat there, alone, drinking, staring at the sea, refusing to see anyone while his entire world crumbled around him. Cleopatra, meanwhile, was anything but defeated. Even now, with everything falling apart, she refused to give up. She was desperately trying to save her dynasty, or at least her children. She sent secret messengers to Octavian, offering to abdicate if he would spare her family. She attempted an insane engineering project to drag her remaining fleet overland across the desert to the Red Sea so she could escape to India and rebuild from scratch. She gathered every treasure she possessed: gold, silver, emeralds, pearls, ebony, ivory, cinnamon into her mausoleum and piled dry kindling around all of it, threatening to burn the entire treasure if Octavian attacked. It was her last bargaining chip. But Octavian was the most patient predator in history. He did not need to rush. Time was his weapon. In August of 30 BC, his armies finally reached the gates of Alexandria. Antony pulled himself together one last time. He rallied his remaining troops, mounted his horse, and rode out to meet the enemy. His soldiers fought bravely at first, but then his fleet surrendered without a fight. Then his cavalry defected, riding straight over to the enemy's side. The end had come. What happened next became one of the most famous tragedies in all of human history. The most common account says Cleopatra sent a message to Antony telling him she was dead. Whether this was a miscommunication, a panicked mistake, or a deliberate manipulation, we will never know for certain. But when Antony received the message, he was shattered. He called to his slave and asked him to kill him. The slave drew his sword, but instead of striking Antony, he turned the blade on himself. Inspired by this loyalty, Antony took his own sword and drove it into his stomach. But the wound did not kill him immediately. And then word came that Cleopatra was still alive, barricaded inside her mausoleum. Antony begged to be carried to her. His servants lifted his bleeding body and brought him to the mausoleum. Cleopatra would not open the doors, terrified it was a trap. So they hauled him up through a window, Cleopatra and her two maidservants pulling the ropes, dragging his dying body up the stone wall. Marc Antony died in Cleopatra's arms, covered in blood, surrounded by the treasures of a dying kingdom. Cleopatra survived him by 11 days. Octavian captured her and treated her politely, but she knew exactly what awaited her if she lived. Octavian planned to parade her through the streets of Rome in chains during his triumph. She would be a spectacle, a trophy, the great Queen of Egypt reduced to entertainment for the Roman mob. Walking in chains behind her conqueror's chariot, while Romans jeered and threw things. Cleopatra had watched her kingdom crumble. She had lost 2 lovers to violence. She had fought for 2 decades to preserve a dynasty that stretched back 3,000 years. She was not going to let it end like that. On August 12th, 30 BC, Cleopatra dressed herself in her full royal regalia. She put on her crown, she arranged herself on her golden couch, and she died. The ancient sources say it was the bite of an asp, a small Egyptian cobra, smuggled into her chambers hidden in a basket of figs. Modern historians debate whether it was actually a snake or some form of poison. But the method barely matters. What matters is the choice. She chose to die as what she had always been, a queen. On her throne, in her crown, on her terms, nobody else's. She was 39 years old. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt became a Roman province. 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization, from the building of the first pyramids to the last breath of the last queen, was over, gone. Octavian, who soon took the name Augustus, became the first emperor of Rome and ushered in a new age. But first, he had one piece of unfinished business. He hunted down Caesarion, Cleopatra's son, with Julius Caesar, and had him executed. 2 Caesars is one too many, his advisors reportedly told him. Cleopatra's 3 children with Antony survived. Cleopatra Selene was eventually married to the king of Mauritania in North Africa, where she ruled wisely and well for decades, keeping her mother's legacy alive in her own way. The 2 boys, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, disappeared from historical records entirely. Their fates remain one of history's unsolved mysteries. But Cleopatra herself became immortal. Not as the seductress that Hollywood invented, not as the temptress that Roman propaganda tried to create, but as something more real and infinitely more powerful. A woman who spoke 9 languages, who mastered diplomacy, warfare, economics, and religion, who ruled the wealthiest nation on earth for 20 years, who went toe-to-toe with the Roman Empire at the height of its power and came closer to winning than anyone dared to imagine. She was not history's most beautiful woman. She was history's most dangerous queen. And 2,000 years later, we are still talking about her. That is the real power of Cleopatra. If this story kept you listening all the way to the end, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Because next time, we are diving into another true story from history that is even more insane than this one. Trust me, you do not want to miss it.